dust explodes. Gunfire cracks. Silence falls. But what happened next wasn't panic. It was strategy. A system so clever, so perfectly engineered, that settlers survived against impossible odds. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how they did it, and why modern survival experts still study their methods. Think about what they didn't have. No electricity, no radios, no supply lines, no reinforcements coming. Just wood, water, ingenuity, and time running out. Yet forts like this held, not because settlers were superhuman, but because they understood something we've forgotten: how to lose less, not make more. We spent weeks researching frontier military records, analyzing fort blueprints, and reconstructing the exact protocols settlers used. What we found was a masterclass in systems thinking. Every element connected. Nothing worked in isolation, and failure meant death. Imagine you're trapped, surrounded on all sides. The nearest help is weeks away. Your supplies are finite. Your ammunition is rationed. Your water is precious. And the people circling your fort have time, numbers, and patience. So what do? You don't fight harder. You fight smarter. You don't make more resources appear. You lose less of them. And that distinction, that single pivot in thinking, is what separated the forts that fell from the ones that endured. The first thing settlers did when surrounded was something counterintuitive. They didn't panic prepare. They didn't scramble to fortify weak points. Instead, they consolidated. Every person moved to the center. Every animal was brought inside. Every supply was inventoried and relocated to a single, protected location. Why? Because a fort under siege isn't about defending every inch of perimeter. It's about defending the core. The moment you're surrounded, your real enemy isn't the attackers outside. It's the chaos inside. Panic spreads faster than any bullet. Fear consumes resources faster than any siege. So the first protocol was psychological architecture. Settlers gathered in the main building, in sight of each other, where leadership could be seen, where decisions could be communicated instantly. Nothing worked in isolation. The physical gathering reinforced morale. Morale reinforced discipline. Discipline reinforced survival. Water was the second obsession. A fort under siege could hold for weeks if water held. But water doesn't last. It evaporates, it gets contaminated, it gets consumed. So settlers didn't just store water, and they engineered water management systems. Barrels were positioned in shaded areas to slow evaporation. Rationing was calculated not by hope, but by mathematics. How many people, how many days, how much per person per day to stay functional but alive. Some forts had wells inside the perimeter. Others had cisterns that collected rainwater. Every drop was accounted for. A single leak in a barrel could mean the difference between holding and surrendering. And here's the part that still gets me. Settlers understood that water wasn't just survival. It was leverage. An attacker outside, in the heat, without access to water, would weaken faster than a defender inside with rationed supplies. The siege became a race against thirst, and the fort held the advantage. Nothing worked in isolation. The water system was tied to morale, to duration, and to the psychological knowledge that time favored the defended, not the attackers. Food followed the same logic. A fort under siege couldn't rely on hunting or foraging. Everything had to come from inside. So settlers brought livestock inside, cattle, pigs, chickens, and managed them like a closed ecosystem. Grain was stored in rodent-proof containers. Dried meat was preserved with salt. Vegetables were rationed. But here's what makes this brilliant. Settlers didn't just store food, they managed the herd. Animals were slaughtered on a schedule, not in panic. Fresh meat extended morale. The knowledge that there was a plan, that resources were being managed, not depleted, changed everything. An attacker outside saw smoke from the fort's fires. That smoke meant food was being cooked. That meant the fort wasn't starving. That meant the siege might fail. Psychological warfare worked both ways. The fort's visible normalcy, cooking fires, routines, the sound of work, was itself a defense mechanism. But the real genius was in the architecture itself. Forts weren't built to look impressive. They were built to function under siege. Firing ports were positioned so defenders could cover every approach without exposing themselves. The gate wasn't just a barrier, it was a kill zone. If attackers breached the outer wall, they'd funnel into a narrow space where defenders had every advantage. The walls themselves were angled, not vertical. Why? Because a vertical wall can be scaled or undermined. An angled wall distributes force differently. A cannonball hits at an angle and deflects. A battering ram loses momentum. The geometry of survival was embedded in every beam and nail. In the interior, multiple defensive lines. If the outer wall fell, there was an inner wall. If the inner wall fell, there was the main building. Each layer bought time. Each layer forced attackers to commit more resources, lose more people, question whether the prize was worth the cost. Nothing worked in isolation. The architecture created a system where every element reinforced the others. Communication under siege was another layer most people overlook. Defenders needed to know what was happening on all sides simultaneously. So forts developed signal systems. A man on the roof watching the north perimeter could signal to a man on the east side with hand signals, mirrors, or smoke. Information traveled faster than any attacker could move. If one section was under pressure, if reinforcements could shift instantly. If an attack was coming from the west, defenders could concentrate there before the assault began. This wasn't magic. It was logistics. It was the understanding that in a siege, information is as valuable as ammunition. A fort that knew where the next attack was coming could prepare. A fort that was surprised would break. And that's why some forts held with a handful of defenders, while others fell with many more. It wasn't numbers. It was coordination. It was the system working as one organism, not as isolated individuals. Ammunition management was brutal mathematics. A defender had maybe 100 rounds. An attacker had time. So settlers didn't shoot at movement. They didn't waste bullets on warning shots. Every round had to count. Marksmen were positioned at firing ports with clear sight lines. They waited for targets that couldn't miss. A horse at a gallop is hard to hit. A horse at a walk close to the wall is a different story. Discipline meant restraint. It meant watching attackers circle, watching them probe, watching them test the defenses, and not firing until the moment of maximum advantage. Some forts had so much ammunition they could afford waste. Most didn't, so they made every shot matter. And when attackers realized that every bullet from the fort was aimed, that there were no wild shots, no panic fire, they understood they were facing people who had a plan. That realization changed the calculus of the siege. Attack a panicked fort, and you might overwhelm it through sheer aggression. Attack a disciplined fort, and you're fighting a system, not just people. The night brought a different kind of warfare. In darkness was when attackers had their advantage. Visibility dropped. Defenders couldn't see threats coming. So forts developed night protocols. Fires were kept burning inside. creating silhouettes of defenders for attackers to see. Why? Because a defender you can see is a defender you won't charge. Psychological defense again. The fort was saying, we're here, we're watching, we're ready. Some forts used reflectors to bounce firelight outward, creating the illusion of more defenders than actually existed. Others stationed men on the roof specifically to listen for sounds of movement, to hear attackers before they could see them. The night became a sensory battle. Who could hear better? Who could move quieter? Who could anticipate the other's position? Defenders had the advantage because they knew the terrain. Attackers were moving through unfamiliar ground in darkness. Nothing worked in isolation. The psychological presence of visible defenders, the sound-based early warning system, the knowledge of terrain, all combined to make night attacks suicidally expensive. And then there was the waiting. This is what people misunderstand about sieges. They imagine constant action, constant violence. The reality was monotony punctuated by terror, days of nothing, then an attack, then more days of nothing. Defenders had to maintain readiness for weeks while doing almost nothing. That's where discipline became survival. Routines kept people sane. Work kept people focused. Knowing that leadership had a plan kept people from breaking. A fort under siege that descended into chaos from boredom would fall before it fell to attackers. So settlers maintained routines. Repairs were made. Supplies were organized and reorganized. Training continued. Watches were rotated. The fort stayed alive because the people inside stayed alive psychologically. And that's something modern survival experts study. The mental architecture of endurance. A body can survive on rationed food and water for weeks. A mind can break in days without purpose and structure. The attackers, meanwhile, face their own crisis. Sieges are expensive. They require maintaining a perimeter, which means spreading your forces thin. They require supplies for your own people. They require patience, and patience is a resource that runs out. If you're a raiding party, you can't stay for months. You have your own homes, your own families, your own survival to think about. So a siege becomes a race. Can the defenders hold long enough for the attackers to give up? Can the attackers break through before their own supplies run out? The fort that understood this dynamic had already won. Every day the fort held was a day the attackers weakened. Every day the fort held was a day the attackers' resolve cracked a little more. Some forts were relieved by reinforcements. Most weren't. But they didn't need to be. They just needed to hold long enough for the attackers to realize that the cost of taking the fort exceeded the benefit. Here's what's remarkable. This entire system, the water management, the food rationing, the psychological architecture, the communication protocols, the ammunition discipline, the night defense, the routine maintenance of morale. None of it required advanced technology. No electricity, no radios, no computers calculating optimal resource allocation. Just human beings thinking clearly about constraints and making decisions that honored those constraints. A modern survival expert looking at a frontier fort sees something we've largely forgotten: the power of accepting limits and working within them instead of constantly fighting against them. We're obsessed with making more power, more resources, more options. Settlers were obsessed with losing less. That's the difference. That's the system that worked. And it worked so well that some forts held against odds that should have been impossible. A handful of defenders surrounded by dozens or hundreds of attackers holding for weeks. How? Not through superhuman strength or luck. Through understanding that survival isn't about being stronger than your enemy. It's about being smarter about resources. It's about building systems where every element supports the others. It's about accepting that you can't control everything, so you control what you can. Water, food, information, discipline, morale, and you let the system do the work. The moment a fort fell, it was usually because the system broke somewhere. A well ran dry, a gate failed, discipline collapsed, morale shattered, attackers got inside, and once the system was compromised, it cascaded. One failure led to another. The fort didn't fall because attackers were stronger. It fell because the integrated system that had been holding everything together came apart. And that's the final lesson. Nothing worked in isolation. The fort was only as strong as its weakest link, and that's why every element mattered. Every barrel of water, every round of ammunition, every rotation of the watch, every moment of discipline, every routine that kept people sane. They were all part of one system, and the system was what survived. This is what we've lost. We live in a world of abundance, or at least the illusion of it, and we've forgotten how to think in systems. We solve problems in isolation. We throw resources at issues without understanding the integrated consequences. We assume that more is always better. A frontier fort teaches a different lesson, sometimes less. Managed brilliantly beats more managed carelessly. Sometimes the answer isn't to make more power, it's to lose less of it. Sometimes survival isn't about being the strongest. It's about being the smartest about what you have. I know if you want to see how this principle applies to other forgotten systems, how ancient civilizations managed resources, how small communities thrived without modern infrastructure, how the constraints we think are limitations are actually the source of innovation, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because every week, we uncover another piece of the puzzle, how humans survived, thrived, and built systems that lasted centuries without the technology we think we can't live without. The next video goes deeper into the engineering of frontier defense. You won't believe what they figured out with just wood and iron.